Recording and all right, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here for the Friends of the Cabildo member lecture series. If you're watching it live with us tonight, or if you're watching it later on, we thank you for participating. And this is actually our last lecture for the month of September. So I just wanted to give you a quick update for October. We have one every Tuesday. We on October 5th, we have Alan Hoffman doing Lafitte in America in 1824 and 1825. Chris King doing The Blues, the authentic narrative of my music and culture book. That's the 12th. On the 19th, Dancing in the Streets, Social Aid and Pleasure Clubs of New Orleans with Judy Cooper. And The Chapel of Love, the story of the New Orleans girl group, the Dixie Cups, with Rosa Hawkins, and who is a member of the Dixie Cups, and Steve Bergsman on October 26th. So I hope that you are able to attend those. Just a reminder that if you do have questions, we love to use your questions as the Q&A at the end. Put them in there. Don't, sometimes I forget all the time, but if you think of something as we're going along, just put it in the chat. We'll answer it at the end when we get Matthew to answer all, your questions at the end. So again, I want to thank you for being here, and we hope to see you in October for our other member lectures. Our speaker tonight worked with people whose voices have been ignored or silenced, both as a journalist and as the assistant director of Shakespeare in Prison. His reporting on criminal justice has appeared in The Atlantic and The New Republic, and he is currently editing the first critical edition of Shakespeare written entirely by incarcerated people. Tonight, our focus is on his newest book, which I will link in a second in the chat, so you could grab a copy. Deep Delta Justice: A Black Teen, His Lawyer, and Their Groundbreaking Battle for Civil Rights in the South. When we talk about how Duncan versus Louisiana changed American law, but it first changed the lives of those who litigated it. Please welcome Matthew Van Meter.
Hey, thanks, Jason, and it's nice to have I guess a hometown crowd. I live up in Detroit, but it feels like a hometown crowd for Deep Delta Justice. So thanks all for spending some time on a Tuesday evening with me. I spent like 5 years working on this book, and I had never been to anywhere in the Deep South before, much less New Orleans. I'm sort of a bona fide Yankee, and one of the great pleasures of the work I did on this book was being able to make 20 or so trips down to New Orleans, and from there to Plaquemines Parish and elsewhere to do the research and reporting that the book required. And there are worse things to do with your time than to go poking around the archives and in New Orleans and talking to people. So that was a real pleasure for me, sort of personally. And one of the things that I learned, and that I hope the book tells people about, is the really unique role that New Orleans had in the civil rights movement. It's not something that historians frankly talk a whole lot about. It's certainly not something that's taught in most U.S. history classes, at least outside of Louisiana. Mostly because it was not a place that Martin Luther King went. We sort of tell a Martin Luther King centric version of the civil rights movement, and because it was more complicated. I mean, as you all know, Louisiana is sort of an order of magnitude more complicated when it comes to race and law and just about anything else than most other states in this country because of its history. And it's messy. It's a tougher story to tell, and so we mostly don't tell it. And so I really enjoyed digging into that history and telling it through the lens of this book, which focuses on a particular case, a particular lawyer, and a particular sort of series of events that happened in Plaquemines Parish in 1966 to 1968. But it's against the backdrop of the really unique role that New Orleans and Louisiana had in the civil rights movement. So I want to talk a little bit about that tonight, and but keep my remarks fairly short. I'm more interested in questions that you all have, but. So in short, the story of Deep Delta Justice is about a 19-year-old, then 19-year-old black tugboat captain and shrimper from Boothville, Louisiana, which any of you who've been down the road in Plaquemines Parish knows is just about the last town on the west bank of the Mississippi, accessible by road. Venice is just below it, and they're kind of grouped together at this point municipally, I think. But it's just before the jump, which is the last sort of Army Corps of Engineers maintained levee before you get out into pretty wild country down there. So he was from there, and coming up in Plaquemines Parish, he and everybody else down there, from that generation, told me there was nothing to do but work. There was working in agriculture and for a lot of folks in the oil fields, particularly at the time, the oil industry was segregated. And so, mostly white folks working in the oil field, but there were beginning to be black people from Plaquemines Parish who were getting jobs in support as contractors. Gary's father, Lambert Duncan, was the first black man to run a cruise ship out to the offshore rigs. That's to say nothing of the, real bounty of the sea that's available there. And people have been, subsistence fishing, shrimping, and oyster farming for generations down there, as well as fur trapping. So it was a place where people knew each other, people worked. It was, for a number of reasons, sort of a racially mixed community, although of course segregated by both by tradition and by Louisiana law at the time. And that was the world that Gary grew up in. Any of you who have been down, particularly to Lower Plaquemines Parish, to Venice or wherever, will know that the land gets really skinny at that point. There's only, at some places, there's only a couple hundred yards between those levees, if that. On the one side, the Mississippi, and on the other side, nothing but marsh. Certainly in the 60s, nothing but marsh, as far as the eye could see and farther. Less of the marshland now, but that's sort of a different story. And so in the middle of all of this, this kind of unique environment, was built up in a number of really unique communities down in Plaquemines Parish. And Gary Duncan's family was kind of at the heart of that. Big family, 9 siblings, and they were all pretty self-sufficient. Most of them dropped out of school at some point because you could make so much money, for a working class kid, picking oranges or hauling mud for the oil industry or whatever, shrimping, whatever else you wanted to do if you're willing to work hard. So I probably don't need to tell you also that Plaquemines Parish was ruled, really, run isn't quite strong enough, by Leander Perez for about 50 years. Perez was first appointed judge in 1919, and he held one office or another in Plaquemines Parish from then until his death in 1969. And for those 50 years, he helped turn Plaquemines into one of the wealthiest rural counties in the United States. There is still municipal water and sewer all the way down there, which for a rural county is fairly rare. There used to be a free bus running up and down. There was free garbage collection for decades. There was, until 2 years ago, I believe, free ferries across the Mississippi. They now cost $1. And that was all subsidized by the oil industry. And it went from being a real backwater, as it had been, pretty isolated, particularly the West Bank, to being one of the great hubs of the sulfur industry, and then particularly the oil industry. And Perez used the power that he had from being a savvy politician and lawyer in that place, not to mention a little kind of not entirely legal or constitutional dealings, amassed pretty tight stranglehold over that area. And as people were moving in to work in the oil industry, he sort of solidified that hold. And one thing that Perez was a great builder of things. He turned that parish into one of the most developed rural places in the U.S. And he was also an avowed segregationist. He didn't make that the main part of his platform until 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education was decided by a unanimous Supreme Court. And he shortly thereafter, in a speech, dedicated the rest of his life to preserving the segregation of the races, and that was basically what he did from that point forward. The last 15 years of his life was pretty single-mindedly directed in that way. He was often called the third house of the Louisiana legislature. He allegedly never missed a session, although he never held a statewide elected office. He had an office in Baton Rouge, and would go to sessions. He was a somewhat masterful writer of laws, particularly the laws that we now kind of group under the heading of Jim Crow. So and particularly was a major sort of innovator of segregationist policy around keeping schools segregated, which was a losing battle for him. But he made a lot of other lawyers work really hard in order to obtain racial integration. So in this place ruled by Perez, Gary Duncan was driving down the road one day in Boothville by the high school, and the schools had just been integrated by a federal court order, which Perez was fighting tooth and nail. And there were a number of schools that didn't open at that time. Belle Chase did not open at that time. Woodlawn School on the East Bank never opened again. That building continued to be abandoned until it was torn down. But Boothville School integrated more or less peacefully. But in mid-October 1966, these two black boys were walking down the side of the road, Gary's relatives, and they were about to get jumped by four of their white classmates. And Gary got out of his car and intervened, and in intervening touched one of the white boys on the arm, and told him to run along home, and was arrested and charged with battery, which begins the case. Now, this is not the sort of case that was making headlines at the time. It was a misdemeanor, and a pretty minor one at that. Gary was charged with a couple of offenses. First cruelty to a juvenile, and then that was dropped, and he was charged with simple battery. But in any case, all misdemeanors were less under Louisiana law. This case should not have gone down in history in any kind of way, except that Gary and his family are sort of unusually stubborn people, thankfully. And Gary's mother would not hear of him pleading guilty to something he didn't do, no matter how minor the offense. And so they lawyered up, and they found Richard Sobel. And Richard Sobel was sort of at the time, 28-year-old hotshot out of Columbia Law School. He had been third in his class. He had clerked for a federal appeals court judge in New York City, and then taken a job at Arnold Fortis and Porter, now Arnold and Porter, still one of the nation's most prestigious law firms, and was volunteering his vacation days essentially to take civil rights cases in the South, and was assigned to New Orleans, and really bitterly disappointed, he told me, that he was assigned to New Orleans because he wanted to go to Selma, Alabama, or Birmingham, or someplace where things were actually happening. And of course, things were happening in New Orleans. He just wasn't aware of them. And he was one of the few full-time civil rights attorneys in the state of Louisiana when he took Gary Duncan's case, and ended up fighting it on what I think a lot of people would call a technicality, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. That's sort of the main story of the book, and there's all sorts of fun twists and turns in there. Perez was not going to let this go down easy, and sort of led to a fairly direct confrontation between Sobel and Perez. But you can read the book for more on that. But that leads me to think about the role of Louisiana, particularly in the civil rights movement, because uh, in some ways, this case couldn't have come out of somewhere else, not just because Louisiana has sort of idiosyncratic laws, which it does, and that was a part of the reason it came out. This case came out of Louisiana. The technicality was about the right to jury trial. Super important case that established the right to jury trial in state court, which had not been established before '68. But but also because I think Gary Duncan's situation was exceptional because of the peculiarities of Plaquemines Parish in South Louisiana, where his family was pretty self-sufficient. They were landowners, they were boat builders and boat owners. They were, by the standards of working class, rural African Americans, pretty well off. Um, uh, Certainly by national standards, they were quite secure, and and that enabled them, sort of empowered them to fight a prosecution that was um, by any measure unjust, but also by any measure relatively small potatoes, particularly within the context of the rest of the civil rights movement. And in order for that to happen, and for this ultimately this landmark Supreme Court case to come out, you needed an incredibly talented, creative, innovative lawyer in Richard Sobel in order to take on the power of the state. But you also needed a brave, stubborn, unreasonably dedicated to the cause of justice defendant in Gary Duncan to be willing to take that case all the way up to the Supreme Court when he could have gotten off easy. He could have pled guilty and gotten some sort of slap on the wrist. He was sentenced to 2 months in jail, which is nobody's idea of a good time, but ultimately probably less traumatic and dangerous than what he ended up experiencing. He was targeted by officials in the parish throughout the course of his case. But Gary never, once he and his family decided that he would not plead guilty to a crime he had not committed, Gary's dedication to that idea never really wavered. And I think about some of that obviously is a testament to who he is and who his family are. Um, and some of it also is a result of the fact that they were able to take that stand because they were in a place that for one reason or another enabled them to take that stand despite Perez, despite the fact that the authorities sort of boot was on the neck of Gary's community. They had, because of land ownership, and because they owned their own businesses and could subsist for themselves. They didn't work for anybody but themselves, and they were proud of it, which was a thing that was difficult for Black folks to do outside of places like Plaquemines Parish. And so all of this sort of came together to create just the right conditions for this kind of case to go up. And in the meantime, Richard Sobel was working on cases in Bogalusa and elsewhere in the state that would end up establishing, um, um, really some of the first big employment discrimination cases under the Civil Rights Act in Bogalusa and elsewhere. And I think for me, uh, I hope that the book helps Louisiana tell its story and helps others outside Louisiana understand the sort of pivotal role of Louisiana in the civil rights movement, and that when there were both local lawyers, white and black, mostly black, and lawyers from out of town who came to help them out, who turned Louisiana into legally one of the most important states in sort of the late civil rights movement, in terms of making good on the promises in the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. Um, and that I think was the last of the big things that really stuck with me in the research for the book was the extent to which I had learned about civil rights history as a succession of Supreme Court cases and legislative victories, hard won, which they all were, but mostly as if those were the end of the story. And by the time the Civil and Voting Rights Acts had been passed in '64 and '65, that was kind of it. And then, and then I guess there were 3 years before Martin Luther King was killed in '68, and then we didn't really know what else to say about civil rights. And actually, the most interesting stories to me happened in the space between those events and after King's assassination, where once the federal government had the power to desegregate schools and public accommodations and all manner of venues and places. That was not the end of the story. That was the beginning of the story, where then a lawsuit would have to be filed in every school district and against every bar or bowling alley or whatever that didn't want to desegregate. And those cases take time. The defendants in those suits were not giving up easy. And in fact, Louisiana was one of the most productive places for those cases to go forward, in part because of the federal judges who were sitting in New Orleans. And so that's all sort of the backdrop of the story of Deep Delta Justice. Although it focuses narrowly on this one case that came up, sort of a junky misdemeanor from Plaquemines Parish, that kind of snowballed into this much larger case about the right to jury trial, and it ended up really fundamentally changing the underpinnings of American criminal law. So I don't know if there are any questions. I'd be happy to take questions. I'd be happy to talk more about any part of the story or the book or any other part of my work.
Yeah, let's see. I did have okay. Ann Marcos very quickly asks us who won the case.
Yeah, important. Sorry, I didn't mean to bury the lead there. Yeah. So Duncan versus Louisiana is the name of the case, and Gary Duncan won. I think a 7-2 opinion, sort of establishing the fundamental right to jury trial. And there's sort of a post story there. There was some sort of shenanigans afterwards, but yeah, I mean, fundamentally they won the case. It was a pretty resounding victory, both for Gary and ultimately for millions of criminal defendants in the decades since.
I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
So, how important was this case? What year was this case, and how important was this case towards all the other cases that eventually led to the civil rights law of 64 and 64?
Yeah. So, so this case, Duncan versus Louisiana was 1968. So it was right at the end of the Warren Court era. Before there was this big sea change in the Supreme Court. Nixon appointed 4 justices in just over 3 years, and really substantially changed the political makeup of the court. And so there was this period from 54 to 69 when the court really was sort of a bastion of moving civil rights forward, right? And so some people really liked that, and a lot of people really hated it, and that was but it was what it was, and certainly created the opportunity for a case like this, because essentially what the court was doing was, quite apart from civil rights cases, it was also taking elements of the Bill of Rights and applying them to the states. So one of the big questions, as anybody who's a lawyer or knows a lawyer in the audience might know, is that the Bill of Rights originally was only considered to apply to the federal government, and the states could do quite literally whatever they want. They didn't have to offer a jury trial. They didn't have to offer freedom of the press. They didn't have to offer freedom of religion. That was all optional. The federal government was limited by the Bill of Rights. And that's how it was until the 14th Amendment was written, which I'm going to say a statement that should not historically be controversial, but I think is politically controversial, which is that the Bill of Rights said that, or the 14th Amendment said that, yeah, in fact, actually all of this stuff in the Bill of Rights applies to the states as well. However, that was a deeply scary notion to a lot of people for all sorts of reasons, and continues to be a controversial sort of position. And so what the Supreme Court started doing in the 1920s was literally going clause by clause through the Bill of Rights and deciding whether or not to apply that clause of the Bill of Rights to the state. So there's one for freedom of the press, there's one for freedom of religion, there's one for, I mean, literally every clause, dozens of these cases. And the 50s and 60s were like the heyday of that happening. So in the Fourth Amendment, you are guaranteed the right to a speedy trial before a fair and impartial jury of your peers. That part of the Constitution had not actually had specifically been held not to apply to the states. The states did not have to provide juries. They didn't have to. It didn't have to be impartial. They could do whatever they wanted, right? And so the contention in this case was: should Gary Duncan have gotten a jury trial? He did not get a jury trial. Should he have gotten a jury trial? But ultimately, the question was about: does this part of the Bill of Rights that can apply to the states? Is the right to jury trial, in fact, a fundamental aspect of our system of justice, or is it just kind of icing on the cake? And ultimately, the Supreme Court said, no, that is indeed fundamental to our system of justice. You cannot have a fair system of justice without the jury system, and so we need that, and applied it to the states. So what had been a patchwork of 51 different systems for jury trials was unified into more or less a single system for jury trials, or at least when you got a jury trial. What that did functionally for people going, so like that's all well and good for like law school and stuff, but the functionally going forward, what that did was it provided the immediate impact was not massive, although there was a lot of panic. It changed the rules in Louisiana and a few other states. But what it did was, by establishing the right to jury trial as fundamental, it opened the doors for many subsequent cases, because it's like, okay, if that's fundamental, then like what does a fair cross section of the community look like, which is what a jury pool is supposed to be. Whom can we exclude? Can we exclude women? Can we exclude people of a certain race? Can we exclude people with criminal backgrounds? Can we, like what does it actually mean? If that right is fundamental, then like what are the boundaries of that right? And there are dozens of cases since, including some fairly recently, that have been about exactly those issues. And without Duncan, those cases don't happen, because the right has to be fundamental before it can be nitpicked, right? I mean, just recently, in Ramos versus Louisiana, this was I guess a year and a half ago, right near the beginning of the pandemic, but relatively recently, the Supreme Court, actually in a case that Richard Sobel argued back in 1972 and lost, the Supreme Court reversed itself when asked whether juries have to be unanimous. Like, when we say jury, do we mean a group of people who decide unanimously or not? Because as you all may know, until recently, Louisiana and Oregon, for explicitly white supremacist reasons, after Reconstruction, changed their jury laws to not require unanimity. Oregon was the worst. You could get convicted of pretty serious crimes by a simple majority out there, and Oregon was the last state to change. And the Supreme Court ultimately came in and said, yeah, no, when you say like the word jury implies unanimous. There's no such thing as a non-unanimous jury. That doesn't exist, which is historically true until Louisiana and Oregon invented it. And so it laid the groundwork for all those sorts of cases. I mean, a really important case in the 1970s about whether prosecutors were allowed to strike jurors, or anybody actually allowed to strike jurors on account of their race, that has gone on to have pretty important real world consequences. So all of those cases, even though they're not called Duncan versus Louisiana, they all cite it. And without Duncan versus Louisiana, all of those cases are sort of unthinkable. You had to establish the right before you could litigate it. So a long answer to a short question, but that's the legacy of Duncan. It's worth mentioning also that there were a number of cases, and this sort of forms the plot of the second half of the book, that were civil cases that were filed against Leander Perez, who used his status as a law enforcement authority to frighten and intimidate people, and there were there were a couple of cases that were intended not just to curb his ability to do that, but in general to curb the ability of local politicians to use their status as law enforcement authorities to intimidate activists. And those cases were ultimately watered down by sort of forces in history that were outside of anybody's control, but were fairly big victories at the time as well. So the sort of outsized influence for a case that started out as, I mean, really the kind of thing that gets prosecuted all the time. I mean, people get prosecuted for battery fairly and unfairly constantly. This one just sort of snowballed into something much larger than I really had any right to be.
And you bring up excuse me, Perez, and was basically his power derived from that he was the sole person down there, and then obviously I'm guessing that if he'd if he started in the 50s, by the time the 60s and 70s rolls around, there's a lot more money that has come into Plaquemines, and not a lot, I mean a lot, because of oil and gas revenue, basically work that came out of there.
Yeah, I mean, it went from being in Perez. So Perez was born in the 1890s, and in the and it was when he grew up, when he was growing up there. I mean, he was on the West Bank, which was, I mean, total backwater. He went to school up in New Orleans, and this would be long before the bridge and everything. Like the guy used to have to like ride a horse to a swamp, or he would walk to a boat. I mean, really out there. And he really had a chip on his shoulder about that. I mean, he both reveled in the sort of glamour of New Orleans. He was an uptown kind of guy in some ways. Certainly his sons were. But he also, was upset that he didn't get to have that, right? And his people didn't get to have that. And so when money came knocking, he was an exceptionally gifted negotiator, schemer, and wielder of power. I mean, he would I describe a bunch of this in the book, and I can't tell you how many drafts of the Perez chapter, which ultimately is fairly snappy, I hope, I had to go through. But it was initial at some point. I wrote like 100-page long version of it because it's just the guy's shenanigans could have filled several books. But he would do a fairly simple technique where he had, through some wheeling and dealing, like obtained local control of the marshland around there, which had been state, the levee board, and like somebody from, I don't know, Gulf Oil Company or whatever, Chevron, would come to him and say, hey, I'm interested in drilling over here. And he'd be like, wait a minute, let me ask the parish council. He'd go to the police jury at the time. He'd go to the police jury, the council, and he'd be like, hey, there's a development company wants to buy that land. And they, would you sell it for $1? It's useless marshland. And so they'd sell it. And then he'd go back to the oil company and be like, so there's a development company there, an LLC based in Delaware, and they'll sell you those rights for $600 or whatever. I mean, it was totally, and everybody in the parish knew this was going on, right? And then he would work out deals where they would pay for school construction, they would pay for road construction. He really he was very protective. He really strong armed those oil companies, and people knew it. And it went from being this, I mean, totally like subsistence fur trapping, I mean, real backwater kind of place, where the ships were going up to New Orleans and never stopping in Plaquemines Parish, to one of the port of Plaquemines is one of the largest ports in the United States still, and so yeah, I mean, he accumulated this power because of the money, because of the clout he had with the oil industry. They were willing to do anything to get at that oil. And because he provided good jobs for people, and that was kind of all it took. And there were some people who tried to resist, but he was usually able to crush them. And the last thing I'll say is that because he was such a gifted legislator, again, he was not elected to statewide office, but he wrote the texts of hundreds and hundreds of bills that became laws in Louisiana. And he was very savvy about, before he got on the segregationist kick in '54, most of that was about accumulating power in local municipalities with flooded lands, with marshland, essentially. to give them as much as much of the oil revenue as possible, and to give them as much power over the state independently from the state as possible. And he was really gifted in that way. And you know, I mean, ultimately, I think a figure of some degree of evil, but also a complicated person. And nobody knows that better than the folks who lived down in Plaquemines, who were both protected by him and oppressed by him. So yeah, I mean, a real interesting character. There is, by the way, and I hinted this in the book, totally, if you don't know it, you should look it up, kind of Shakespearean drama that went down between his sons, Leander Jr. and Shallon, particularly in the 1970s and especially in the 80s. I think the Times-Picayune ran like a 25-day long like serial piece about their sort of falling out and lawsuits and shenanigans and you know oil dealings and all manner of stuff. So it's good. I mean, it's good, juicy, like Louisiana politics stuff.
And Marcus, you have another question I have written down here. I'm going to actually end with that one because I think that's probably one everyone wants to know. So we'll come back to it. Barbara Bowen asked if you can clarify, and Barbara, help me out if I say this incorrectly, the jury trial to the Supreme Court to his case of touching a white boy. So was that
right?
Did that go from? How did that flow?
Yeah, it's like most things in the law. It took a bunch of arguing to figure it out. So I can walk you through the chain of command or the chain of custody or whatever of that. So Gary Duncan touched this white kid on the arm when he was saying, run along home or whatever. The kid goes back and like complains to his mom. His mom calls the cops, who arrest Gary. Or I'm sorry, they don't arrest Gary, and then somebody tells them to. And a couple of days later, they come and arrest Gary, and he gets charged with cruelty to a juvenile, which is essentially a family court offense. It's not even doesn't rise to the level of misdemeanor. However, it was so Richard Sobel, when he was hired by the family, or when he was, there was no money to change hands, but when he took the case, first thing he did was he looked at the law and he was like, oh, actually, I mean, so in order to be, and this is still true, in order to be guilty of cruelty to a juvenile, you need to have custodial authority over the victim. You need to be a parent or babysitter or something like that, teacher. And clearly, in no world in 1966 in Louisiana did Gary Duncan have any sort of custodial authority over a white kid, who was just a few years younger than he was. And so that was thrown out. And then the next day, Gary was arrested again, and this time he was charged with simple battery. So simple battery is the sort of unwanted and threatening touch. It's a misdemeanor at the time in Louisiana, punishable by up to 2 years in jail. And it was the 2 years in jail that becomes important down the road. Like I said, it was a technicality. So there's a trial. There is what I think is I'm pretty proud of it. There's a trial scene in the book. I was able to track down the transcript, despite the lack of any court records in Plaquemines, thanks to not Katrina but a courthouse fire. But in any case, so at the trial, one of the things that Richard Sobel objected to is he said, Your Honor, my client has a right to a jury trial under the Sixth and 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution, right, promising him a jury trial. And the judge said, quite rightly, oh no, he doesn't. Actually, the Supreme Court has held that states get to do whatever they want when it comes to jury trials, which was correct at the time. And so they have a trial, and then at the end of a trial, again, as anybody who's a lawyer in here knows, like, you're not allowed to like relitigate the facts, right? The facts have been found. Gary Duncan was declared guilty. He was sentenced. And so the only thing you can appeal is when there's an error of law, when somebody has made a legal mistake. It's the only grounds for appeal. And the only legal mistake that had been made, according to Richard Sobel here, was that Gary Duncan should have gotten a jury trial under the U.S. Constitution, which is a bit of a Hail Mary pass. Right? You don't usually throw the Bill of Rights at a judge in a misdemeanor case. It's just not done. But he did, and knew that the Louisiana Supreme Court, which was the next court up the ladder, would again quite rightly deny the appeal, which means it was going to the U.S. Supreme Court. That was sort of the only place it could stop. And Sobel knew that the U.S. Supreme Court was in the business at the time of extending clauses of the Bill of Rights and making them apply, it's called incorporating them against the states. That is applying them to the states. And so it was sort of a favorable court. I mean, he didn't think he had, snowflake's chance in hell of getting into the Supreme Court, because they don't take a lot of cases, but he did. And once he got into the Supreme Court, I think it's not that victory was assured. They could have ruled any number of ways, including narrowly just kind of throwing out the case or sending it back. There was no reason for them to write a sweeping decision, but they did. And so the question of law there is, does the jury clause of the Bill of Rights apply to the states and not just to the federal government? And the only reason that came up is because Gary had been denied a jury trial in this simple battery case. And the only reason that was found to be egregious is because in Louisiana, a misdemeanor, the lower category of crime, was defined not by the length of the sentence, but by the type of punishment. So a misdemeanor was anything punishable by a fine or imprisonment of any term. And a felony was anything punishable by hard labor or death, right? And so you could get as little as a month of hard labor, and that crime was considered a felony. And you could get as much as 10 years in prison, and that was considered a misdemeanor. And that was just how Louisiana did it. It was a vestige of French law, like a lot of things down there, and that was just how they did it, and there was no problem until the Supreme Court came in and said, no, actually everybody needs to be in line here, and eventually set the more or less arbitrary rule of 6 months. And so it was the reason was that Gary Duncan was not, he was sentenced to 2 months in prison, but you could get sentenced for up to 2 years for simple battery. And the Supreme Court thought that being able to be sent to prison for 2 years without having a jury was in violation of the Constitution, and so wrote this big sweeping decision saying that juries are fundamental. We all need to offer them, and any crime in any state that it has a maximum penalty over 6 months, you have the right to a jury trial. No problem, like no questions asked. I hope that clarified. It's all sort of.
No, that was great. No, that helped. Okay, so the last question, which we have, which I wrote down and somebody else wrote down, you did mention that you interviewed Richard Sobel for the book. Can you tell us a little bit about where the two of them are, if they're still around? Were you able to interview Gary Duncan?
Yeah, Gary's a good friend of mine. He lives in Harvey now. His family lived on the family plot in Boothville until Katrina, and a few of them still do. His older siblings, he's the youngest of 9. Wow. His eldest sibling, I think, is 94 now. All going strong. She still drives to church every Sunday. But Vivian Duncan, who's a warhorse. No, I got really close to that family, and spent a lot of time with them at sort of family reunions. I went down to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, which is the last church on the Mississippi, where their family's been for a long time. Gary's a deacon down there. So yeah, I mean, I've spent hundreds of hours with Gary Duncan and really gotten to know him, and that's been one of the real joys and blessings of working on this project. Is just outstanding human being, his whole family. But I mean, super litigious. I could barely understand a lot of my interview recordings because there'd be like somebody hollering in the back about whether they put too much filet in the gumbo or whatever. But it was great. Richard Sobel. So I got in touch with Richard Sobel at first. That was sort of the first thing I did when I was working on the book. I was a graduate student at Columbia at the time, and he had gone to Columbia. So I heard about the story, and so I wrote him a letter and took it to the alumni office. And I was like, listen, I know you're not allowed to give out addresses, but I know y'all are really good at tracking people down, even if they don't want to be tracked down. So I was like, if I just give you this stamped, unaddressed envelope, would you send it to Richard Sobel? And they did. And he put me in touch with Gary and sort of got this whole thing rolling. And I had a bunch of, I mean, just really, I mean, rich interviews with the guy. He's one of the great civil rights lawyers. And it's a real shame that more people don't know his name. Um, so Richard passed in March of 2020. Not related to COVID, but you know, partly because his contributions to the law are less known. He was not a big self promoter. And in part because we were sort of in the grips of the early wave of COVID at the time. It was I and a number of other people worked really hard to try to get obituaries in papers, and nobody was taking them for about a month. And finally, the New York Times wrote a really beautiful obit, and that sort of triggered a number of others, which felt good because he deserved it. But he went on to work. To essentially invent Title VII law, which is employment discrimination based on race, sex, religion, ethnicity, and a couple of other classes. The first big cases to be decided under Title VII were his in Bogalusa, Louisiana, which is a whole nother story y'all should check out. Um, Involving some very heavily armed black vigilantes called the Deacons for Defense and Justice. In any case, and then Richard went back to Washington D.C. and worked for the for Marian Wright, now Marian Wright Edelman, who is in charge of the Children's Defense Fund. So he worked for that before it was called that. And then started a civil rights firm where he worked, employment discrimination and racial justice and policing cases basically until he retired. And after some sort of family tragedies, retired fairly early. Moved back. He moved to Slidell, I think, for like 20 years. And then he was not well for the past few years and passed away. But they remained friends. That was one of the really neat things for me is that Richard and Gary stayed friends for the rest of Richard's life. And I had the good fortune to be able to spend some time with them together. Richard later in his life lived in Northern California, and I went out there with Gary and his wife to see Richard when Richard was really not well. And it felt like this really beautiful thing to see. These two old men. Richard was in his 80s, Gary was in his 70s, who never under any kind of normal circumstances would have met, but ran into each other 55 years ago and just really genuinely like each other and respect each other. And it was that was a really beautiful thing to see. I tried to capture some of that in the book, particularly towards the end. But there's a some of you may know. So there's a documentary based on the book called "A Crime on the Bayou" that premiered over the summer, and that's available for streaming now on Amazon and Apple TV and all the usual platforms. And it'll be on cable sometime in I think November. And one of the things I love about that film is that Nancy Bursky, the filmmaker, who's amazing, was able to get a cameraman out to Northern California during a trip when Gary and Richard were able to be together, and you can just see what good friends they are from the footage of the two of them hanging out by the Pacific Ocean. It's a heck of a thing to see.
That I think that's a great place for us to stop. I'm going to link again the book, um, uh, Deep Delta Justice. So if you haven't got the book, please get a hold of it. And
Yeah, and let me put in a quick plug for Amazon is fine. Well, Amazon's not fine, but you can buy the book on Amazon. I will not complain. If you, but I'll put in a quick plug for Garden District Books, which is run by a good friend of mine, and they will be happy to take your money and put it to better use than Amazon will. So
there you go. Yes, as we're good friends with those guys as well. So we hope you'll get there and grab it. And thank you for the A Crime on the Bayou recommendation. I will take a look at that and see if we can
check it
find
out.
that. Maybe we can do that as part of our film series. So Matthew, I want to really thank you. This was a fascinating talk, and also the way the story is so much bigger once you start breaking it down. And so I really appreciate you taking the time for us tonight to educate us on that. And we appreciate it. And we'll be sending this out to everybody next week. I mean, tomorrow, so that they can watch it later on in the week if they're not here tonight. So Matthew, thank you so much, and we thank everybody for attending tonight.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. Have a good night. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Bye.